A very warm welcome to all participants to today's research webinar that's organized by the Center for Transportation and Logistics at IIM Ahmedabad. I am going to be the moderator for today's webinar. I'm Sandeep Chakrabarti. I am a co-chair of the Center for Transportation and Logistics. We call it CTL around here. And I also chair the Public Systems Group, which is an academic department within IIM Ahmedabad. As many of you already know, the CTL is a thematic research group at IIMA that is committed to conducting and facilitating collaborative and interdisciplinary research in transportation, logistics, and allied areas with the intent of contributing to scholarship practice and policymaking in India and abroad. The CTL has over 15 now IIM Ahmedabad faculty members who are affiliated to the CTL, and they work on contemporary and futuristic challenges confronting governments and businesses, from decarbonizing transportation to enhancing accessibility using technology, and from managing freight operations to optimizing warehouses and terminals. In the last academic year itself, our center faculty have collectively published over 50 articles in top international peer-reviewed journals. As part of our commitment to public dissemination of academic research, industry best practices, and government policies, we routinely organize research webinars, panel discussions, and practitioner-led talks. You may visit our website or join our mailing list for updates on upcoming events, or even visit the website for viewing some of our past events. Research webinars, such as this one, feature distinguished faculty members who are internationally recognized for their outstanding work with significant implications for policy and practice. Today, I'm delighted to introduce to you Professor Ram Pendyala, our research webinar speaker. Ram is a professor of transportation systems and the director of the School of Sustainable Engineering and the Built Environment at Arizona State University. He also serves as the director of TOMNET, which is a US Department of Transportation funded Tier 1 University Transportation Center. Professor Pendyala is an expert in activity travel behavior analysis and in the analysis of factors that shape our mobility choices. Professor Pendyala's talk today is titled, as you can see on the screen, Does Ride-Hailing Use Affect Vehicle Ownership or Vice Versa? As you know, Professor Pendyala's talk is extremely relevant in today's Indian context, given the rise in shared mobility options and experiments, the great expectations from privately operated shared systems, and the lack of understanding in policy circles on whether and how to regulate shared mobility so that they can effectively contribute to sustainable development. Professor Pendyala is going to examine the relationships specifically between household vehicle ownership and ride-hailing use frequency. He's going to explore causal connections, asking the question of whether vehicle ownership levels affect ride-hailing use frequency, or is it the other way around, which is, does the adoption and use of ride-hailing services affect vehicle ownership? As the abstract mentions, his findings seems to suggest that ride-hailing can affect changes in private vehicle ownership in the future. And therefore, I'm really excited and I look forward to the research findings and the implication. Some instructions for the audience is that you can use the Q&A box or the chat box for typing out your questions. And we are going to, and in fact, we'll make sure that we take up your questions towards the end and have a discussion. So with that, I would like to invite Professor Pendyala to take over. Over to you, Professor Pendyala. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate the kind introduction and And it was a very good, succinct introduction of the concept that I'm trying to present today. So again, I really appreciate the invitation. It's an absolute honor and pleasure to be with you all today. So, I do want to just say that this topic was indeed inspired by, as you said, the rapid rise of ride-hailing use in many cities, many countries around the world, and so the whole impetus is then to think about, well, what is ride-hailing use going to do to vehicle ownership? Because vehicle ownership is often associated with travel demand, vehicular travel demand, vehicular kilometers of travel, and all of the things that are, unsustainable about our transportation system. And so the question is ride-hailing potentially going to help reverse that trend towards private vehicle ownership and hopefully lead us on a path towards more sustainable mobility choices among households. So thank you again for this opportunity. Before I get into the actual talk, I do want to acknowledge the research team. I actually don't do any work. All the work is done by the glorious research team. And many of you, I think Professor Chandra Bhatt at the University of Texas at Austin is no stranger to IIM Ahmedabad and to probably many, many in the audience. And so he provides a lot of the methodological capabilities. He's our methodological guru, so to speak, and provides a lot of that key capabilities that allow us to unravel some of the complex relationships that we are trying to discover and really understand better. His PhD student is Aupal Mondal, and then my students at Arizona State University, Abby Dirks, and Irfan Batur are here at ASU, and then so we banded together to really look into this question. So I'll go through the usual steps of a presentation, starting with a little bit of an introduction. I'm probably just repeating a lot of facts and figures that you may be aware of, but about a dozen years ago, Uber launched. So it is impressive to see that it's already been a dozen years since these ride-hailing services have come into being. In 2012, we had a few more. About a decade ago, Lyft and Via and so on began arriving in US cities. Now, of course, in the literature, there's some distinction that is made between mobility on demand, mobility as a service, transportation network companies, and those are fine, nuanced differences. For purposes of this presentation, it really doesn't make a very big difference as to those differences. So we're essentially referring to any ride-hailing type service. I will use these terms interchangeably, so any of these Uber, Ola type services pretty much come into this sphere. And so there's, a worldwide expansion. They're very popular in many, many cities around the world. And you can see here, Uber alone serves, more than 10,000 cities in 72 countries. And there you can see Ola and some of the others that have a major presence in various countries. If you look at the market growth, of course, in 2011, that's when they came into being. And so that was a $0 moment. But since then, the growth has been astronomical, so to speak, with about 86 billion in 2021 and more than 180 billion by 2026. So those are the projections. And then if you look at the worldwide users as well, it is in the tens and tens of millions. across all of these different shared platforms. And the share of Americans, I mean, just looking between 2015 and 2018, and of course, after that, the pandemic may have had some impact, but again, we're very rapidly returning to pre-pandemic conditions with respect to mobility choices, mode choices, and so on. The share of Americans who have used ride-hailing services more than doubled since 2015. And I'm sure that red section, who have heard of but not used the services, that is probably smaller now than it was in 2018. And even the 3% may have evaporated by now in terms of the percent who have not heard of these services. So I'm just providing some background. This is again from the Pew Research Center in the United States. They tend to collect data from large samples across the country and provide information about the latest trends in terms of use of technology, transportation, work from home, and things like that. And so if you look at the percent of US adults who say they have ever used ride-hailing services, so this is the percent that have used ride-hailing services at least once in their life, so to speak, you'll notice there is heterogeneity. There is a difference across market segments. So you'll see 51% of youngsters between 18 and 29 have used ride-hailing services. The corresponding percentages for the other age groups are lower. Similarly, you'll see that 55% of college graduates have used ride-hailing. The other percentages are lower. And again, income shows, again, a trend that you would expect, with 53% making $75,000 or more per year using ride-hailing, and the other lower income groups showing smaller percentages. So there is heterogeneity. It does vary by socioeconomic characteristics and things like that, which you would fully expect. There's also urban and rural gaps in ride-hailing service usage. So if you look at, so the green is urban and the darker bar corresponds to rural, and you can see the urban percentages substantially higher than the percentages for rural residents. And so certainly I think ride-hailing services has largely been an urban phenomenon, and not so much in rural areas, again, very understandably so. Now, there is quite a bit that has been written on the impacts of ride-hailing services on the transportation system. And a lot of what has been written recently suggests that perhaps the unintended consequences of enhanced mobility provided by these services are not all pleasant and positive. So there are studies that blame Uber and Lyft for public transit's decline. Yet another study shows Uber and Lyft contributing to urban traffic congestion. And another study that says Uber pollutes more than the cars it replaces. And so there are, so certainly ride-hailing services have become very popular because they provide very convenient, on-demand, flexible mobility. And at the same time, however, that enhanced mobility perhaps does come at a price and at a cost, because it's essentially like an on-demand taxi service. And so now you have everybody just going around in cars using this on-demand taxi service. So these unintended consequences are not all that surprising. So there's been a lot of studies that have looked at various aspects of ride-hailing adoption and what are the impacts of ride-hailing adoption, right from user profiles, who uses ride-hailing, and how much do different socio-demographic groups use ride-hailing? What are the impacts on other modes in terms of transit usage and so on? A lot of the services, they like to say, oh, we are the first mile, last mile solution for transit. We complement transit. The evidence suggests otherwise, that they are much more of a substitute than a complement for transit. And then there are, studies and claims about the impacts of ride-hailing availability on vehicle ownership, that ride-hailing is able to eliminate or reduce the need for private vehicle ownership, and therefore ride-hailing will have a positive impact on the environment and advancing sustainable transportation, and so on and so forth. A lot of papers have looked at trip characteristics of ride-hailing, the vehicle miles of travel, and how much of that vehicle miles of travel is deadheading. That is just zero occupant traveling and cruising around, so to speak, and the impacts on traffic congestion. And then, of course, travel demand. Does the availability of ride-hailing actually induce net new demand, that is, new trips that would have not been undertaken otherwise? So lots of studies. Ride-hailing literature now is very, very rich. We are focusing on that one aspect, which is the impacts on vehicle ownership. And I just wanted to say that this is one aspect among many, many aspects of the impacts of ride-hailing that one could explore. So the question, right? So you might ask, why are you bothered about this relationship between ride-hailing use and vehicle ownership? We know it's an inverse relationship, right? So vehicle availability or vehicle ownership and ride-hailing use, as you would expect, they have an inverse relationship, right? A higher ride-hailing usage is seen among those with low vehicle ownership, and vice versa. Low ride-hailing usage is seen among those with high household vehicle ownership. So that inverse relationship is both obvious and well-known. So why are we bothered about this, about the direction of this relationship, of this causal relationship? And the reason we are concerned about it is because for the claims that ride-hailing use will reduce vehicle ownership or will contribute to lower levels of vehicle ownership into the future as we keep moving forward, for that claim to be true, we need the causal relationship to be in a certain direction. And that direction has to be that ride-hailing usage frequency impacts vehicle ownership. If the causal relationship is reverse, and that is vehicle ownership affects ride-hailing use, then that claim is on very shaky grounds. Because what's happening is people acquire the vehicles that they want to acquire for their household, and then the ride-hailing use level will stem from that vehicle ownership choice. Okay, so for ride-hailing use to really impact vehicle ownership, the causal direction has to be one where the ride-hailing use frequency, people have to adopt ride-hailing, start using ride-hailing, and then they can slowly but surely shed vehicles, okay? Because they have adopted and started using ride-hailing as one of their key mobility choices. Now, interestingly enough, if you look at the travel demand forecasting models we have in place, they pretty much assume vehicle ownership affects ride-hailing usage, right? So if you look at travel demand forecasting models in use probably around the world, vehicle ownership is modeled or established for all of the households in the model system. And then ride-hailing is seen as a mode choice. And so mode choice comes much later in the model chain. And so essentially vehicle ownership is driving ride-hailing usage. And so what's happening as a result, we really do not see any potential impact of ride-hailing use on vehicle ownership. And so is that the right causal relationship that travel demand forecasting models should continue to represent in their behavioral structure? Or must travel demand forecasting models start thinking about how to accommodate the reverse causal structure, where ride-hailing use affects vehicle ownership, and thereby travel forecasting models will be able to represent the potential impacts going forward. And that's why this is an interesting causal relationship, because it does have implications for what we can say about the impacts of ride-hailing on the future of vehicle ownership. It is often postulated that ride-hailing services can lead to lower, reduced levels of private vehicle ownership and a more car-free lifestyle. In fact, if you look at a recent report published by the University of California, Berkeley, by Martin, Shaheen, and Stalker, they looked at the impacts of transportation network companies on vehicle miles traveled, greenhouse gas emissions, and travel behavior for Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, and San Francisco. And you can see that their results, looking at these three markets, is that on a per TNC user basis, so there's, vehicles shed, vehicles suppressed. Vehicle shed is essentially you have vehicles in your household and you are shedding a vehicle. You are actually disposing a vehicle. Vehicle suppressed is where you never acquire the vehicle in the first place. Okay, so it is a suppression of vehicle ownership. And then vehicles acquired. So there's a small percentage where we actually see ride-hailing users acquire a vehicle. So that's a very, very small percentage. And if you take those three together, you get the top right, that is the net change. And essentially, this study says that on a per TNC user basis, there's a 9.6% net reduction in personal vehicles, potentially leading to a more car-free lifestyle and a more reduced car ownership future. So this suggests, and this study is suggesting, that ride-hailing usage is causing a change, is leading to a change in vehicle ownership. And yet our travel demand forecasting models do not reflect this causal direction. And the question is, to what extent is such a causal direction truly prevalent in the population? So I could argue, and one could very plausibly argue, that it's likely a two-way relationship. And so we want to fully recognize that as well, that vehicle ownership levels may influence the extent of ride-hailing usage, but the extent of ride-hailing adoption and use may impact vehicle ownership. So you have this two-way relationship between these key mobility choice phenomena. So the research question is, to what extent are both of these causal structures prevalent in the population? Okay, so we're not taking the position that it is one or the other. What we are suggesting is that maybe both of these causal structures are prevalent in the population. And the real question is, to what extent is each causal structure prevalent in the population? Is one causal structure very dominant when compared to the other, or are they about equally present in the population? And so what is that relative presence of these two different causal structures in the population? And why do we care about this question? So one is, if both causal structures are substantially present in the population, then certainly transportation demand forecasting models should reflect this duality accurately. That is, transportation demand forecasting models cannot simply assume one causal structure and apply it to the entire population when there is a substantial percentage following a reverse causal structure. And then the question that I was raising, if the structure where ride-hailing usage affects vehicle ownership, okay, so if that structure is largely absent, okay, so if ride-hailing use affecting vehicle ownership is not prevalent, then it is unlikely that the dream of a reduced vehicle ownership future can be realized, okay, because it is then somewhat, safe to say that people are acquiring vehicles and their ride-hailing usage is simply stemming from their level of vehicle ownership. And so if we don't see that causal direction, perhaps all these claims that, a ride-hailing is going to slowly help us realize a future of reduced vehicle ownership, those claims really cannot be made. And in fact, it is kind of interesting. I mean, if this is the latest American Community Survey data, and you can see household vehicle ownership, and you can look at what is the percent of households with no vehicles. And the percent of households with no vehicles in 2021, this is, 10 years after the advent of Uber, a full 10 years later, we have seen absolutely no shift in vehicle ownership trends. In fact, 2021 shows the lowest percentage ever of households with no vehicles. So it doesn't look like a car-free lifestyle has necessarily been embraced. And in fact, if you look at the maroon line, that is the 3 or more vehicles available in the household, okay? You actually see that percentage has consistently ticked upward in an era of ride-hailing services. So despite the growth in ride-hailing services, I mean, you would have hoped and thought that households would be, I don't need that third car. Okay, I can do away with that third car. I can just use ride-hailing if and when necessary. But we don't really see that. The 3 or more vehicles percentage has actually ticked upward throughout this period of ride-hailing services. So it is kind of interesting to see this trend, at least on a macro aggregate nationwide basis. So for our study, however, we wanted to do a disaggregate choice analysis and really understand what's going on. We did a very comprehensive survey with a large team from Arizona State University. Those are some of the team members there at the time. Now Professor Deborah Salin is still at ASU. Dr. Sarah Coiney, she has moved on, and Dr. Dennis Baker as well. Michael Manis is at the University of South Florida. Of course, our dear friend, Professor Chandra Bhatt and his former students, and then also a very, very close friend, Professor Patricia Mokhtarian at Georgia Tech, and her colleagues and former students as well. So the 4 universities basically got together and did a survey across the 4 metro areas. We have a small sample in Tampa, which is the home of University of South Florida, but the other areas, we were able to get more than 1,000 respondents, yielding a sample of 3,400 plus respondents. So that's a very healthy sample across these 4 metro areas. And the survey was done before the pandemic. So the pandemic was not on people's minds and nowhere in sight when we actually did this. And it just so happened we finished the survey, wrapped it all up, and then slowly the pandemic started emerging, or stories about it started emerging. But this is what we call the T4 survey, the TomNet Transformative Transportation Technology Survey. Here's the survey instrument. We collected attitudes and preferences, vehicles that households own, and where they live and work. We collected information about current travel patterns and choices, mobility on demand services, autonomous vehicles, how they feel about them, to what extent they will adopt, to what extent they will use, what are some of their attitudes and perceptions towards these new technologies. And then, of course, we collected all the background information, social demographic data and so on. So here's some of the survey sample characteristics. Nothing too dramatic. I will say a little bit higher on the female percentage. Again, not unexpected. A reasonable distribution in terms of the age distribution. Slightly higher on the younger adult group. But again, we have a very good variation across all age groups, and that's all you really need from an econometric choice modeling standpoint. And so employment status, about a little more than half are workers. You can see the education attainment is slightly on the higher side. The racial mix, again, somewhat as expected for a sample of this nature. And of course, in the United States, the vast majority do have a driver's license. Household annual income, again, shows a very nice distribution with, about a third in that middle income of $50,000 to $100,000 per year. The household size skews a bit on the higher side, but again, nothing worrisome there. About 70% indicate that they live in a standalone home. About a similar percentage own their home, as opposed to about a quarter who rent. And then you can see the locational mix of the sample, with about 30% each in Atlanta, Austin, and Phoenix, and only 7% in Tampa. So you can see that all four of these metro areas are fair weather cities. They are metro areas, not the cold places of the north. And then here's vehicle ownership. Only 4% indicate they reside in households with 0 vehicles. So we are lower. So we have a slightly higher level of vehicle ownership compared to the census data. But again, these are 4 very automobile-oriented metro areas. So for these metro areas, 4% is actually quite aligned with what you would expect. The average miles driven in a week, again, shows a pretty good variation. Main commute mode, drive alone, more than 70%. That, again, is very consistent with expectations. And you can see the commute distance as well, where for commute related variables, we're looking only at workers. And then of course, the survey included a host of attitudinal statements. So we really tried to elicit people's attitudes, because when we did our modeling, we wanted to make sure that we accounted for these attitudes. Otherwise, they tend to be unobserved variables that tend to mix, tend to impact really the inferences that you can draw. So this is on a 5-level Likert scale, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And, I'll just point to a few. I mean, this is on a scale of 1 to 5, and you can see the commitment to an environmentally friendly lifestyle is 3.8. It's one of the higher. So people are indicating that they are committed to an environmentally friendly lifestyle. But when it comes to a less polluting means of transportation, It's only a 3.1, so things get a little weaker when you start saying, oh, well, you should be bicycling and using transit. Not so much. I mean, especially in these 4 metro areas, transit service is not that wonderful. And so that commitment to using a less polluting means of transportation is not as strong. That's a 3.1. And in fact, public transit is a reliable means of transportation, only has a 2.0. So people simply don't see public transit as a reliable means of transportation. Interestingly, they are bothered by congestion to some degree, 3.7. And look at this one. I definitely like the idea of owning my own car. That has the highest score at 4.5. So in these 4 metro areas, very automobile-oriented transportation system, the culture and the attitude is one of, I just like the idea of owning my own car. And so vehicle ownership tends to just be very much ingrained in the system. Now, we did ask attitudes, perceptions, and values with respect to ride-hailing services. And you can see, there's some positives here. Ride-hailing services are good alternatives when the car is unavailable, when transit is not available, helps you save time and money on parking. So somewhat on the positive, side with respect to those 3. But here, ride-hailing services allow me to live with fewer or no cars. Not a lot of traction for that statement. So only a 2.5 score on that. And then ride-hailing services help me get to and from public transit. Again, less than a 3, a little better, but generally it doesn't look like ride-hailing is necessarily seen as a substitute for the car. So at least from an attitudinal statement standpoint, okay? So here's the variables of interest. So you can see the ride-hailing usage on the left-hand side. 62% indicate that they have ride-hailing experience. 38% said that they've never used ride-hailing, even if they're familiar with it, but they just haven't used it. And then what we also see is that there's monthly, rarely, kind of usage. So monthly and weekly is somewhat small. Together, that's about 20%. With respect to vehicle availability, we actually, categorized households as owning no cars, which is only 4%. And then the rest of the households, we categorize them as automobile deficient if you have fewer autos than adults. And then automobile sufficient if you had at least 1 automobile for every adult in the household, with adult defined as 18 plus, okay? And we find only 22% reside in auto-deficient households. They have fewer cars than adults, while all others are, and 3/4 are sufficient. They have at least 1 car for every adult in the household. Now, what we're interested in is the relationship between these variables. And indeed, even in our data set, we notice this inverse relationship, this inverse bivariate relationship. Among the households that have no vehicles, you will see a much higher level, the yellow and green, a much higher level of ride-hailing use. As soon as you go to households that have a car, deficient or sufficient, you will notice a much lower level of ride-hailing use, especially when it comes to a weekly basis, okay? And so there is this inverse relationship. We see it very clearly. And so the question then is, well, what is that causal relationship? And so we adopt a modeling framework that can unravel and uncover this latent, unobserved causal relationship between these 2 variables. So there's individual level attributes, social demographic, and even the psychosocial latent factors. And then that is going to impact which segment, right? Which latent, unobserved causal segment you fall into. And then, of course, there's all the usual socioeconomic and psychosocial latent factors, attitudinal factors that impact, these endogenous variables, your dependent variables being vehicle availability and ride-hailing use frequency. And I put this one in green because that is the pathway to sustainable transportation. If ride-hailing use frequency affects vehicle availability, it is this segment that offers the promise of sustainable transportation and lower vehicle ownership levels in the future. So what is the size of this segment where we see this causal relationship versus the size of this causal segment? And that is where we have a joint model of behavioral choices, thanks to our good friend, Professor Chandra Bhatt. I won't go through this in detail, but essentially we're treating both of these variables as ordered choices. So level of ride-hailing usage is an ordered choice, right? Never, rarely, monthly, weekly. You can see it's a nice ordered dependent variable. The same thing with vehicle ownership. You have no vehicles, you're auto deficient or auto sufficient. It's a nice ordered discrete variable. So we're using both of them as, or treating both of them as ordered response variables. And so you have this underlying latent propensity that you can model as a function of a host of explanatory variables and the random error term, with this latent propensity essentially revealing a level of ordered choice based on a mapping to thresholds. And so this is the very usual ordered response choice model specification. And you can write that in a multivariate ordered outcomes fashion because we have two here. So therefore, it is a multivariate context, not a single ordered response variable. So this simply writes it in a multivariate ordered outcomes in matrix form. We're able to formulate the likelihood function for a single individual Q following a certain causal structure, okay, and falling into a causal segment H. And so this H refers to a causal segment because the direction of the causality is dependent on which causal segment or causal structure you are looking at. And so therefore you have that subscript H corresponding to the causal segment. And then you have the latent segmentation model itself. So this is the probability of individual Q belonging to segment H, and that takes the form of a standard logit function. And so then you can write the likelihood function for individual Q as, as the product of the probability of belonging to a segment times the conditional probability, right? The condition probability given you are, the individual belongs to segment H. And the overall likelihood function for the sample is simply the product over the unconditional probabilities. And that essentially, we just adopt a maximum likelihood estimation methodology, of course, because it is a complex likelihood function. Some nuances and some more, effective estimation methods that Dr. Bhatt has developed are invoked in order to estimate the parameters that comprise delta that you see here. Okay, so with coming to the results then, here is segment one. Oops, sorry. So there is segment one. So this is the segment where let me see, where ride-hailing frequency impacts vehicle ownership level. I think this is reversed from the figure, but in any case, the results are all correct. So essentially, even after controlling for a host of socioeconomic, demographic, and attitudinal variables, so we pretty much control for all of these, we include a host of socioeconomic, demographic, and attitudinal factors, we do find that ride-hailing use has a significant negative influence on vehicle ownership level. All the other relationships you see here, the green represents positive, and the other color represents a negative impact, is pretty much what you would expect, right? High income, those living in apartments, if you have, just a short commute distance, you're more apt and more likely to be using ride-hailing at a higher frequency. But if you're in a low population density, you're not a worker, you're kind of in the older age group, you're less likely to use ride-hailing. Similarly, vehicle ownership, high income, et cetera, higher education leads to higher levels of vehicle ownership and so on. What is interesting is we did find the latent attitudinal factors also had very strong impacts on these endogenous variables. But the inverse relationship between ride-hailing frequency and vehicle ownership is very much significant, even after controlling for all of these explanatory factors. The same thing with segment 2, where vehicle availability impacts ride-hailing frequency, very similar findings. And again, there is a significant negative influence from vehicle ownership to ride-hailing frequency. And so then you go to the segmentation model. Okay, so we find those relationships, both causal structures, very much, offer the results that one would expect. So what is the relative sizes of these market segments, these causal segments? And we do find, very interestingly, which was, somewhat unexpected, I must say, is that the segment where ride-hailing use impacts vehicle ownership is, in fact, 58% of the sample, compared to the other segment where vehicle availability affects the level of ride-hailing use, accounted for 42%. I think I personally had gone into this study thinking that segment 2 would be a very dominant segment, and this segment 1 would be very, very small, suggesting that we don't have a lot of hope for a reduced vehicle ownership future. But looking at these results, which were quite revealing, it very much seems that this segment where ride-hailing use is impacting vehicle ownership is in fact a fairly large segment. It's more than 50% of this sample, generally suggesting that there is some hope in terms of realizing that dream that ride-hailing use, as it picks up steam, it picks up more and more usage, will in fact lead to a lower vehicle ownership future. So that is the conclusion. So we find certain populations may have used ride-hailing services now long enough to influence their car ownership. And that is why we see the 58% in that segment. Perhaps, now that ride-hailing has been around for, a dozen years, I guess maybe 10 years by the time we had done that survey, it looks like ride-hailing services had been around long enough to influence car ownership for a sizable segment, and hence you see them in that causal structure. So the market segment where ride-hailing frequency affects vehicle availability is actually larger, and so our travel demand forecasting models should definitely reflect. You see, both of these causal structures have substantial presence in the population. So a travel demand forecasting model should not and cannot adopt one causal structure and apply it to the entire population. And so we really need to think about how can we specify our travel demand forecasting models to incorporate multiple causal structures. And then I will, finish out with, the findings suggest that a future characterized by, mobility as a service may indeed see lower auto ownership. And if you ask, well, why aren't we seeing that? Because I showed you the American Community Survey data, and we don't see vehicle ownership levels showing any dramatic change over the last decade, or many years, in fact. And I think, my thought there is that it simply takes time for this phenomenon to play out. Vehicle turnover, shedding of vehicles, and so on, it just takes a long time because people hold on to their vehicles now for ever longer number of years. And so it just takes time for this phenomenon, for that causal structure to really play out and for people to feel comfortable to shed their vehicles. And the other issue is that the cost, right? In order to use mobility as a service on a daily basis, on a frequent basis for all of your household travel, that cost may prove to be a critical barrier. And that may be holding back the actual realization of what might be possible given that causal structure. So very interesting findings, and we'll be curious to see how this plays out perhaps over time, because any causal phenomenon really needs the benefit of time to play out, to be realized. Okay, anytime you're talking about cause and effect, the notion of time has to automatically come into the picture, because you have to have a cause, and then it takes time for the effect to be realized. And therefore, this is just something that perhaps will play out over time. And I think a lot of our data collection efforts should move towards collecting that longitudinal data and panel data so that we can actually observe these changes and causal phenomena over a period of time. And so with that, thank you so much. I really, again, appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ram. This was extremely insightful, and thanks for actually going through the methods. And I'm sure a lot of members in the audience would have surely benefited from the methods. I do see one question by Anshuman Pal, and the question is that this is an interesting and positive result. Is vehicle sufficiency a significant factor in categorizing the two segments? And Anshuman asks whether there is a strong correlation between vehicle sufficiency and some of the other significant factors, such as number of vehicles owned.
Yeah, so I'll have to go back and look at the segmentation model, but I believe the segmentation model is largely based on socioeconomic characteristics. So whether we actually consider vehicle sufficiency or vehicle ownership in the segmentation model, I'm not 100% certain, but it may very well be in there. So, but essentially, the segmentation is based on the host of socioeconomic and demographic variables. So that pretty much dictates, the categorization into the two segments. The strong correlation between vehicle sufficiency so vehicle sufficiency is essentially representing vehicle ownership. So vehicle ownership is not entering. So vehicle ownership is an endogenous variable. It is one of the dependent variables. So it is not one of the significant factors in the sense that it's not an explanatory variable. It's the actual dependent variable. And that's how vehicle ownership is represented in terms of sufficiency.
Okay, thank you.
So hopefully that cleared that.
Right. So there's another question by Divay Pranav, and Divay asks that I work for a ride-hailing company in India. Although the availability of ride-hailing services may not discourage citizens from buying vehicles, it may help reduce the number of miles of personal vehicle use. So vehicle miles traveled. But governments, including the Indian government, they discourage shared mobility in the country. What can be done about it?
Interesting question. I do agree that perhaps, so having ride-hailing services may not impact vehicle ownership, but may reduce the number of miles driven of personal vehicles. That's entirely possible, but then I think you're essentially shifting the miles from your personal car to a ride-hailing vehicle, right? So let's say, rather than, to take your own car to the airport and park it there, perhaps you take Uber or Lyft or Ola to the airport. I mean, still, it's still all vehicle miles. So I'm not necessarily certain as to whether that vehicle miles is making all that much of a difference from a sustainability standpoint. But so the idea is to really try to reduce vehicle ownership. And by reducing vehicle ownership, we, of course, on the one hand, reduce the amount of infrastructure we need to essentially park all of these personal vehicles that are really parked for 90% of the day, right? They're just parked in some location for a good part of the day. And so by moving towards a ride-hailing model, we just reduce the amount of infrastructure we need for just parking and housing all of these personal vehicles. And perhaps by charging for trips by the kilometer, we make it we influence travel behavior in terms of how much people will travel. Because once you purchase a vehicle, the marginal cost of driving is actually very, very small, right? So the vehicle itself is a huge sunk cost. You have now purchased the vehicle. And so now the marginal cost of actually using that vehicle is quite low. Whereas if you are using ride-hailing services and paying by the kilometer, then you are paying kind of that full cost of the trip. And when paying that full cost, it may act as a deterrent from undertaking trips that may not be necessary, so to speak. I'm not sure how exactly governments are discouraging shared mobility. I would think that governments should be trying to incentivize shared mobility. So I think, having policies that incentivize shared mobility, providing all kinds of incentives, preferred parking, or some sort of, rebates and discounts and so on for shared mobility is certainly the way to go. But also perhaps the reverse needs to happen, and that is to say you discourage solo riding or solo driving by imposing some sort of pricing on the solo rides and solo driven trips.
Great, thank you.
I do see the follow-up where he says some modes of shared mobility, such as carpooling, ride sharing, are illegal. That is actually news to me. I was not aware of that. I hope that all of you can influence the government and really work on this. I'm not quite sure of why, carpooling or ride sharing would be made illegal. That seems a bit.
The organized app-based systems are not illegal, but I guess the larger point is we still have some sort of a policy vacuum in many of these spaces that governments are kind of clueless on whether or not to regulate in the first place. So again, I think the findings such as yours would probably be encouraging to probably by governments to find ways to encourage more investments in the shared mobility space.
Absolutely.
So I see a question from Professor Arun Srikumar, and his question is whether you have considered the heterogeneity in the quality and density of ride-hailing services between the metropolitan areas in your sample, or do you believe that this heterogeneity is captured in individuals' attitudes captured in the survey towards the ride-hailing services? And he asks because one can see marked differences in cab availability between cities in India, for example, on ride-hailing apps.
That's a great point. It's just so happens that the 4 metro areas that we chose to do our survey, which is the Phoenix, Austin, Atlanta, and Tampa, those are 4 very automobile-oriented, rather similar Sunbelt cities in the United States. So there's really no differences between these 4 metro areas in terms of the extent of their highway systems, the extent of vehicle ownership, household vehicle ownership, very, very similar types of patterns. You also see great similarity in terms of ride-hailing services. All 4 are very large urban metro areas where ride-hailing is ubiquitous in all 4 of these areas. So the heterogeneity in ride-hailing services between these metro areas is virtually non-existent, or definitely very negligible compared to the heterogeneity in individuals' attitudes. So in other words, even though the services might be very similar, the attitudes of people towards these services do differ, but we did capture that heterogeneity quite effectively in our model specification. So from that standpoint, I think we've been able to reflect that individual heterogeneity, and the heterogeneity in the service itself is probably non-existent in our sample, simply because we did not include very remote rural areas in our data collection effort.
Great, thank you. I just have a quick question, it would be really nice if you could probably sort of elaborate on the point that you mentioned towards the end of your presentation, which is the following, which is, we're looking at ride-hailing use frequency and car ownership sufficiency in contexts where car ownership levels are incredibly high in the first place. Now, ride-hailing has been there for about 10 years, but ride-hailing has really picked up, let's say, 5-6 years. Do you expect people, existing car owners, to really sell off their cars as a result of ride-hailing use? Because we know that once one has a car, car owners are pretty sticky with their vehicles, right? So probably they're going to use the car for fewer number of trips. Maybe they would avoid car use for certain kinds of trip purposes, or maybe reduce their total vehicle miles driven. But perhaps that car would still be there, probably spending a little more time in the garage. So I'm just wondering whether the effect that, the desirable effect that you find is kind of underestimated, right? There could be a lot of folks that want to give up their cars, but
Yes.
haven't really made up their mind of whether or
But
not to
haven't.
sell their
Yeah.
car.
Yeah.
So how would you
yeah.
deal with that? Yeah.
Yeah. And in fact, I think that is precisely what we are postulating based on what we have found, because we feel we have applied a very rigorous methodology to try to unravel the relative presence of these two causal segments. And so in a very automobile-oriented set of metro areas, we're actually finding that 58% seem to belong to the market segment where ride-hailing use impacts vehicle ownership. And this is not what I would have expected. In very automobile-oriented metro areas, I would have fully expected people acquire cars, and then they figure out how much ride-hailing they're going to use based on, their vehicle ownership levels and vehicle availability and so on. So this was quite surprising. And so indeed, I think your explanation makes most sense. And that is, I'm fully thinking that what's happening is people are thinking about potentially substituting some of their car travel or their cars for ride-hailing services. However, because people hold on to their cars for a long time, so vehicle transactions tend to be an extremely lagged choice phenomenon. People hold on to their cars for a long time because they have their cars, they will use them, et cetera, et cetera. It simply takes time for the shedding of vehicles to take place. And so I'll be curious to see what the vehicle ownership patterns and so on look like, say, a decade from now, once the current fleet has aged and people may be thinking about, I don't need that third car. See, I don't think people will ever go to zero cars. That's not going to happen. But the question is, are they going to shed that extra car? So, if you're at 3 cars, are you comfortable going to 2 cars because you can now use those and you've really picked up using ride-hailing services and so on and so forth. So on the margins, will we start seeing car ownership, cars shedding, so to speak?
Right, exactly. And I think, there could be a lot of latent demand for car shedding in this group that's not really getting picked up in the car sufficiency number. And therefore, the car shedding intent could be actually larger, which could mean that there is this positive impact of ride-hailing on reducing automobile dependence. This causal direction that you find could actually be stronger than what's estimated in these.
Yeah, I'll be curious to see. I mean, at this point, I think that only time can tell, and that's where I think the longitudinal data collection would be very helpful, because sometimes we don't pick things up in the macro trends, but you will be able to see things in a disaggregate survey data set.
Right.
Over time.
Okay, so we can take a couple of more questions quickly. We're really running out of time, but there's one question from Samantak Chakraborty, and his question is, the population where insufficient vehicle owners are in majority, like India, can it have different results compared to the to the US as they are habitual to use their own vehicle? So I think the larger point is that whether we should expect similar findings if we were to do this survey in India, for example.
I would actually, to some degree, expect and hope that in a country like India, the segment where ride-hailing use impacts vehicle ownership would be much larger. And the reason I say that, it is like, to some degree, with ride-hailing use becoming so prevalent in a country like India, a lot of households should be able to skip the vehicle ownership step in their evolution of their life. So in other words, just like India has largely skipped the whole landline telephone acquisition, right? Of course, there were landlines and lots of folks had landlines, but in many ways, India was able to skip this ubiquitous landline telephone ownership and jump right into the use of cellular telephones. And similarly, I'm thinking lots of households should be able to skip the whole step where they acquire one vehicle for every adult in the household and simply say, we can do fine with one car, okay? And then for everything else, we can use ride-hailing services. There's no need for us to acquire 2 cars and 3 cars like everybody in the United States did. So I would think in India and many developing countries, I was actually thinking that may be a more prevalent causal structure, that ride-hailing use will impact how many vehicles households choose to own and acquire.
Right. But that gets us to another question that Sagar Verma asks. And the question is, in an Indian context, vehicle ownership is often seen as a matter of pride and prestige and prosperity and social status. So in such situations, if we incorporate that aspect to the response that you just gave, how would you look at this?
That's an interesting. So I would think that would benefit from a data collection effort in India, right, where you have a rich set of attitudinal questions. You know, again, I think with the passage of time, I think the pride and prestige of owning a car, I think that will slowly fade. You know, I think that was certainly there. I certainly recognize that that is a factor, but I just feel that it will fade over time. It'll become less and less of a big deal to own a car. And I think people will, and the convenience and cost factor will slowly but surely become the more dominant influencing variables. But I think a survey that really gives us a sense to what extent is vehicle ownership seen as a validation of one's success and so on, and the prestige of your being. I think it would be great to really get a sense of how much that still exists even today.
Okay. Wonderful. I think we've really run out of time. So if any other participant has any pressing question, they could please feel free to email to us, and we will make sure to forward it to Professor Pendiala so that he can take a look at it. So thank you, everyone, for joining this research webinar, and a huge thanks to Professor Pendiala for making time and presenting his work. It's been a delight to have you, and I'm sure that the participants have gained a lot from your presentation, but also from the discussions that follow. Big thanks from all of us here at the Center for Transportation and Logistics and the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. We look forward to hosting you again in the future, and possibly in a physical format also.
Thank you. Thank you. Much appreciated.
Or engaged discussions with you. So until the next CTL event, it's a thank you and good night to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.